Whispers from the Future by Elton Gar. Susan set her binoculars aside and let the curtain fall shut, the flowers lit by the noonday sun. She had become obsessed with her new neighbor. He had moved in 3 weeks ago, and there was something odd about him. He claimed to be a history professor from Maine, but he wasn't teaching. All he ever did was sit on his porch reading a book and drinking hot tea. Who drank hot tea in the summer? The strangest thing was that after watching him read for hours, she still hadn't seen him turn the page. Instead, from time to time, he simply made a gesture similar to turning the page, but without touching anything. If she hadn't noticed that oddity, she might have stopped watching him. It had begun to feel wrong after the third day. Now she had spotted other oddities. The most notable was when he spent 2 minutes examining the mailbox flag, flipping it up and down while grinning with an odd bemusement. Not enough to draw much attention on its own, but everything added up to make it clear he was a communist spy. She considered calling the police. Frank would almost certainly drive over, but she decided instead to investigate herself. The first step was to meet him instead of relying on information from the neighbors. She had known Kate was unreliable since she served fruit when it was her turn to host the neighborhood watch. And Rachel didn't even have flowers in her yard. So Susan reluctantly walked away from the window and spent the next 2 hours making a peach cobbler. With cobbler in hand, Susan approached the strange man. She wondered as she did if she should have waited for James to get home. But he would have asked questions. He'd probably also get the neighbor talking about sports or something else Susan didn't care about, and ruin her chance to find out anything useful.
"Hello, Mom,"
the man said. He was about 40, with thick round glasses and a book open in his lap. He stood up as she approached, putting the book aside, careful to move it so she couldn't see the inside. The cover was black leather with no title. She had hoped to catch him reading some commie book like The Grapes of Wrath or Robin Hood, but she wasn't willing to give up yet, so she continued and said,
"Call me Susan."
"And you can call me Henry,"
he said as she handed him the cobbler. He looked at it like he had never seen a dessert before. Then, breaking out of the odd stupor, he said,
"I'll get some plates and silverware."
Susan tried to look through the door, but he only opened it wide enough to slip through sideways and closed it behind him, so all she saw was part of a leather couch and brown shag carpet. So instead, she turned over the book. She only had time to see a few words and recognize that it was indeed English before she heard him and put the book back down. If he was a communist, it would be dangerous to let him know she suspected. Henry sat 2 small plates down next to his book. As he cut the pie, Susan asked,
"What did you think of President Kennedy's speech?"
"I don't have a TV,"
he said, and he looked vaguely sad, but why would he be sad about that? She had assumed he would listen to it on the radio like she had.
"My favorite part was Ich bin ein Berliner,"
she said and watched him carefully. She couldn't read his reaction. Perhaps he really hadn't heard it, or he knew some German. He looked a little German.
"I don't remember much, but I know it was a good speech,"
Henry said. It had only been yesterday, but Henry's reaction was that of someone remembering something they learned in elementary school and had barely thought about since. She opened her mouth to ask another question, but Henry interrupted her thoughts and asked,
"Do you think it's going to rain?"
Susan wanted to tell him she didn't care. She wanted to tell him how rude it was to avoid her questions, but she couldn't figure out a good way to say it that didn't reveal what she was doing, so she agreed it was likely to rain. He then moved the conversation to one of the neighborhood dogs, and then asked her questions about her family so that no matter how hard she tried, Susan couldn't pin him down. He seemed intent on being boring, at least until she asked him about his job as a history professor. He told her about his theories on ancient civilizations and what the world was like when the pyramids were built. The pyramid builders wouldn't have been the only civilization, of course. Perhaps everyone else had been hunter-gatherers, but there was no reason they had to be. They simply had built nothing that lasted as long as the pyramids. He went on like that for some time while they finished their pie, and he seemed almost relaxed. But she couldn't imagine discovering anything useful while talking about theoretical ancient civilizations, so Susan excused herself and went home frustrated. Still certain something was odd about Henry, Susan returned to her binoculars. She watched him every day for the next 3 months. There were a number of odd things about Henry, but the most strange was that he never left his house. His car was a nicer car than Susan's, but it hadn't moved since he bought the house. Susan knew because once she noticed, she had snuck over at night and marked the tires with some chalk. Then after months something changed. It was November 23rd, and she was so upset about President Kennedy's assassination that she had stopped watching Henry for several hours. Then when she looked out the window, she saw his car was gone. He must have known about the assassination and been waiting for it. And now he would make his move, and Susan decided she would make hers as well. This was the time for every patriot to act. So she changed out of her bathrobe and walked across the street. She knocked 3 times, the third so hard it hurt before she was convinced there wasn't anyone inside. She felt a rush as the doorknob turned in her hand. If it had been locked, she probably would have turned back, but since it was open, she didn't see any harm in looking around. The living room was what she expected. There was thick wall-to-wall carpet and a couple of chairs. Against the opposite wall was a bookshelf filled with classics. As Susan looked at their varied colors and sizes, she realized something she should have noticed long before. Henry had been reading almost constantly for months, yet it was always the same book. Even if he was reading the Bible, that seemed excessive. She knew she should turn back. If Henry came home while she was inside, she could only imagine what might happen. But she continued forward. There was something wrong with Henry, and she was going to find out what, because killing the president might be the start of something bigger. Carefully moving into his kitchen, she pushed the door open slowly and cringed as it squeaked loudly. Henry needed to get that fixed. The only thing odd about the kitchen was the toaster oven. It had a round tray on the bottom that turned. It seemed unnecessary, but Henry was clearly wealthy. And she didn't have time to examine it. Instead, she opened the fridge. It was filled with TV dinners. That might explain why he never left the house. But she was getting nervous, so she moved quickly towards the back of the house. Nothing seemed out of place until she reached the basement door. It was metal. That was odd, but even odder was the small box on the wall next to it. There were numbers on it, and next to that was a black box with a hand drawn in white lines. She didn't know what it was for, but since it was next to the door, she suspected it was some type of locking mechanism. If Henry had anything incriminating, this was where he would keep it. But just because he had a metal door wasn't a good enough reason to call the police. Before she could decide what to do, she heard a car door shutting. Nearly panicking, she rushed towards the back door of the house. She would flee into his backyard, then climb the fence once he was inside. That door was also metal, but it slid open. She rushed out. She would jump the fence and circle the block so no one would know she was snooping. She made it only a few steps into what should have been his backyard before she came to a stop. She was in a cave considerably larger than the house she had just left. That wasn't possible. There were other houses where this cave would be. Still, it was here, and it might explain why Henry was acting so strangely. The cave was filled with machines covered in flashing lights, huge piles of colorful plastic boxes, and people in trucks driving around. Before she could turn and flee back into the house, she was confronted by a man with a gun. Susan screamed, terrified mostly because she couldn't explain any of this. As she did, a dozen people turned to watch her. But before she could scream again, a hand grabbed her lightly by the wrist and pulled her back into Henry's home.
What are you doing?
Henry asked. He sounded more frustrated than angry.
I thought you were a communist.
Susan said. None of this made any sense.
If I told you this was a communist plot, would you believe me?
Henry asked.
I don't think so.
Susan said. If the Russians could do whatever she had just seen, then the war was over.
Well then, we might have a problem, because the truth is much more dangerous than that.
Henry said.
Are you an alien?
Susan asked.
I'm as human as you are. and I do study ancient civilizations. It's just that your civilization is one of those I study. I had come to witness some important events. You can probably guess at least one of those events.
Henry said.
So you're just here to watch us?
Susan asked. She wasn't sure she believed him, but she would listen.
Not entirely. I was given permission to visit your time because of my studies, but this place was built because we've done a lot of damage to the world. So I can exchange small amounts of air from my time and yours. I can also bring back food and other resources.
Won't that just pollute the world faster?
The world is a big place, and the amount we're exchanging is tiny and spread out across the world and different times. We have sent people back as far as 1 million years ago, and there are plans to send a larger group of people back even further. With a few thousand of these stations, we might save the world.
What happens if you change things?
Susan asked.
That seems impossible or nearly impossible, but the plan is to not be noticed.
Henry said.
So what are they going to do with me?
Susan asked.
The good news is that I get to decide. And it isn't all that easy to change things. If you tell people what you saw, they will think you're insane. If you convince someone to come, I can close the gate so the only thing they could find would be some computers in the basement. That might cause me some difficulty, but it's unlikely they would understand them well enough to matter.
You have a computer in your basement?
Susan asked as she glanced at the door to his basement. She had seen a computer once, and it was far too large to fit in Henry's basement. Of course, there was a huge cave out his back door, so his basement might be larger than it looked.
It's where I keep my records. I also have one in my watch and another in my book. Things have advanced a fair amount between this time and mine,
Henry said. Thinking of the assassination yesterday, Susan said.
I need to know, are things going to get better?
The look of pity and sadness on Henry's face told Susan everything she needed to know.
Author's note. When I was a teenager, I used to watch Nick at Night most evenings. There is something about old sitcoms that appealed to me. There are a lot of cliches in those shows, and while some people may see that as a bad thing, I think it is one of the most charming parts of the shows. The limitations that they work inside to create the art. One of those cliches is the odd neighbor. There are many varieties, but one of the more common was the nosy neighbor. They were irritating, rarely funny, and almost always right. The people were hiding something. They were a witch, a genie, or pretending to be gay so they could live there. Them being right was the reason for this story. I wanted to create an entirely unreasonable character who just fell into being right. It isn't exactly like those shows, but I enjoyed writing it, and I hope you enjoyed reading it. If you enjoyed it, you can get more of my work by signing up for my newsletter. Just go to www.ansci-fi.com and go to the link that says Free Book. Or if you'd like to get access to all of my short stories, you can sign up at patreon.com/Elton at any level. Elton Gar.